that's the core of our study, in the sense that we're going to establish in this study exactly who Yahweh thinks Edom represents, and that's all that counts at the end of the day, isn't it? What God presents that is going to be the arbiter of who Edom represents in the scheme of things. Let me just start by who some believe Edom represents in the latter days. Some begin with a very flimsy premise. Now, here's a quotation from a modern Christadelphian writer. He says this: "First, it is taken as a conclusion requiring no proof that the prophecies of the last days concerning Edom are about the Arabs, since so many of the Arab tribes are descended from Esau, and because ancient Edom is unquestionably Arab territory today." Now, that is absolute nonsense. But you know, this is what's happened, hasn't it, in the history of our brotherhood, is that brethren will make statements which are quite incorrect, and when they are accepted as a premise, then you can build whatever structure you like on that premise. Now, this premise is flawed in a number of ways. It is not true that so many of the Arab tribes are descended from Esau, because there are no descendants of Esau in the earth today. And ancient Edom is a small part of modern Jordan. Now, we've just been there. There's not that many Arab peoples there, by the way. So when you start looking at this, it's absolute nonsense. So this premise has been accepted by some, and there is a large proportion, and I mean this because I travel around, I know there's a large proportion of our community who are either totally confused about this matter, or who are firm believers that the Arab nations are going to attack and defeat Israel. This is all before Armageddon, by the way. Now, of course, it's nonsense. Remember the quotation from Brother Thomas? I'm not going to read it again, brothers and sisters, I don't need to. You remember that? You can either accept the first quotation, which we put up, or you can accept this one. Well, I'll tell you which one I'm going to accept, and I'm going to show you why. We're going to have a look at Isaiah 34, and we're going to see precisely what God does in setting forth who Edom is in the latter days. And there's no question about that. Now, remember our roots in Genesis 36? We went back there, we had a look, but here in Genesis 36 we have the kingdom of men portrayed, and the enemy of Jacob, Esau, his kingdom is outlined there, and his roots. And we saw, of course, that he does represent all nations, all anti-Semitic nations to be precise, as Obadiah 15 told us. And the all nations involved in the controversy of Zion are called Edom in this context of Isaiah 34 verses 1 to 6. It's going to be the centre of our study here this afternoon. So let's come to Isaiah 34 and see if we can analyse it. Now, Isaiah 34, of course, is part of a context. This context starts back in Isaiah 30, it goes through to the end of Isaiah 35. Isaiah 30 is about Armageddon. You can go back and you read words like this: "In the day when the towers fall." What do you reckon that might be? "Yahweh goes forth as a whirlwind and as a fire." You come to Isaiah 31. Yahweh's furnace is in Zion. His fire is in Jerusalem. And who's the subject of his judgments? Well, the Assyrian. And the term the Assyrian is used in this prophecy because, of course, in the days of Isaiah, the Assyrians invaded when Hezekiah was king, remember? And that becomes a type of the latter-day Gogian invasion of the land. Where were the Assyrians destroyed? Well, outside the walls of Jerusalem. Where will Gog be destroyed? Well, outside the walls of Jerusalem, in the valley of Jehoshaphat. See? So you've got this type that is presented from what happened in the days of Hezekiah that is brought here. It's the underlying history of the prophecy that Yahweh is delivering in chapters 30 to 35. And so it is, as you come to the end of chapter 31 of Isaiah, just cast your eyes back briefly. It says this in verse 8 rather. "Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword." Where? We'll look at verse 9. "He shall pass over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the ensign," read Christ, "said Yahweh, whose fire is in Zion, and his furnace in Jerusalem." What comes next? Well, Isaiah 32 verse 1 says this: "Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment." What's the first thing that Christ does after he defeats is Gog in the land? Well, sets up the throne of David. And so chapter 32 is about the beginning of the rule of Christ and the saints. Kings shall rule in righteousness, and princes, etc., in judgment. Chapter 33 goes on to talk about how this all comes about. Look at verse 1. Woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast not spoiled. Any bells ringing in your ears? There's a couple, some in my ears actually. But any bells ringing in your ears? Ezekiel 38. Hast thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou come to take a prey? So here it's palpably obvious, isn't it? But this is a context about Armageddon. But I'll tell you something that happens, and only really careful Bible students pick this up. Something happens towards the end of Isaiah 33. The language begins to change from Armageddon type language to the language of Genesis 10 and 11. And you know what? There are some Hebrew words that you don't find in many other places, but in Isaiah 33 and Genesis 10 and 11. I wonder why that would be. Well, because you see, the events post-Armageddon are about the treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God, and that's about the destruction over 40 years of the Roman Catholic system, which will set itself up in opposition to the rule of Christ. And they will say he's the Antichrist. They're already priming their people for that, aren't they? They've got their people ready. So when Christ turns up in 10 years' time, if he comes this year, he turns up in 2021 and he obliterates the Gogian Confederacy upon the mountains of Israel, the Catholic Church will say, well, we told you so. There he is. He's the Antichrist. So that's what's going to happen, brothers and sisters. And that's why the language changes in Isaiah 33. Now you come with me to have a look at some of the ways this is presented. Have a look at verse 18 of Isaiah 33. Thine heart shall meditate terror. Where is the scribe? Where is the receiver? Where is he that counted the towers, the migdals? Guess where that word first occurs in your Bible? Genesis 11 verse 4. They went eastwards and they built a tower under the tutelage of Nimrod. That's where it occurs, and that's why the language now comes from that era. Have a look at verse 19. Thou shalt not see a people, a fierce people, a people of a deeper speech. Speech? That's the word, Safar. Guess where it first occurs? In your Bible. Genesis 11 verse 1. They were all of one lip, one Safar. Right? And you go on. Verse 20. Look upon Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eyes shall see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed. The words shall be removed just happened to be one Hebrew word, Nasar. Guess where it's first used in the Bible? Genesis 11 verse 2. They journeyed eastward. So you can go on like that, brothers and sisters, and you'll find that the language of Isaiah 33 is actually drawn from Genesis 10 and 11 and the rebellion of Nimrod, because this is about the destruction of the papal system. So what do you reckon Isaiah 34 is going to be about? Well, it starts with Armageddon, but it culminates in the destruction of the papacy, of Babylon the Great. That's where it culminates. And of course Isaiah 35 is a picture, isn't it, of the millennial age, when all the sons of men shall know Yahweh, the God of Israel, and shall serve him with uprightness of heart. They will have been redeemed and brought into the bonds of the truth. That's what Isaiah 35 is about, as we shall see. So that's why Brother Walker's comment that you've had time to read behind me is quite important. And Brother Walker says this in his, he finished, of course, the book, The Ministry of the Prophets. It was begun by Brother Roberts and not completed because he died in 1898. Page 498, he writes concerning Isaiah 34, the opening of this chapter is an emphatic challenge of wide-reaching application that at once tells us that we must not limit the matter to the times of Isaiah, or a century or two later, nor to a few hundred square miles of territory that properly belonged to Edom in his day. In other words, Brother Walker's saying this is not about ancient Edom, and this is not about the territory of Edom. This is about who Edom represents in the divine scheme of things. So he's given us a good footing upon which we can proceed. Now, I want to read, first of all, from verses 1 to 4, without reading all of those words again, just picking up a few of the ideas. Look at verse 1 of Isaiah 34. Come near, ye nations, to hear. And hearken ye peoples, there's an S on the word, it's a plural word, peoples. Let the earth hear, and all that is therein, the world and all things that come forth of it. For the indignation of Yahweh is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. Now that begins with Armageddon, doesn't it? But it will not culminate until 40 years later. Now what happens 40 years later? Well, the abolition of all human governments. Read verse 4 with me. And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. Now what's that kind of language? Well, in Hebrews chapter 1 verse 11, Paul uses this language of rolling up a scroll of the end of the Jewish commonwealth, Judah's commonwealth. It's like rolling up a scroll. Now, what does heavens represent in the scheme of things? When it says all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, well, heaven, symbolically in the scripture, we know, represents governments, doesn't it? So read that again. Let me paraphrase it for you. All the host of human governments shall be dissolved. Now that won't happen until the end of 40 years of conflict. We know from Revelation chapter 14 there will be a 40-year period of judgments and the treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God, about which we're going to speak tomorrow, God willing, at some length. So this is about the end of that 40 years. It's about the rolling up of human authority upon earth. It's about the dissolving of all human governments. They're all abolished in verse 4. So when we come to verse 5, are we talking about the beginning of this process or the end of the process? Well, it's the latter. It's about the dissolving of the last power that has to be destroyed before Christ can have full dominion over all the earth and over all peoples upon the earth. It's about that power. Now, we come to verse 5. For my sword, he says, shall be bathed in heaven. What does he mean? In the governments of mankind. Behold, it shall come down upon not Idumea, it should read Edom. It shall come down upon Edom and upon the people of my curse to judgment. Now this word curse is a very interesting word. Karem. It means doomed, devoted to destruction. In Strong's dictionary of Hebrew words, it sits next to the name Hormah. You know, the one that appears in Numbers chapter 14, where the Amalekites pursued the Israelites who tried to go up and take the land without the ark, etc. Pursued them to Hormah, means utter destruction. That's what that word means. The word is used of Jericho as a devoted city. It was devoted to utter destruction. It occurs in Zechariah 14 verse 11. There will be no more utter destruction. That's the word. It is the last word of the Old Testament in the Hebrew language. Lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Karem. It is used in the context of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15:21, where the phrase things which should have been utterly destroyed is actually just the one Hebrew word, Karem. Its root, Karem, occurs 7 times in 1 Samuel 15 as utterly destroyed when God sent Saul out to destroy the Amalekites. So you can't miss it, can you? This is about utter destruction. It's very important that we recognise this, because these people, whoever they are going to be devoted to utter destruction. There are other people who will be associated with them in the battle of Armageddon who will not be given to utter destruction. We're going to talk about them a little later on. Okay? So it's very important we understand that God has decreed that this mob, whoever they are, Edom, the land of Edom, are devoted to utter destruction. Now Edom means red, as we've seen, as identified with Adam, the flesh, here in political and religious manifestation. While Bozrah, which is what we read next, because it says this, for Yahweh hath a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. I'm at the end of verse 6. So he talks about a sacrifice in verse 6. Yahweh hath a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Bozrah can signify fortification, sheepfold or vintage. And when you take these two names, Edom and Bozrah, together in the appellative sense, that is, when you use names as a vehicle, they denote the blood of the sheepfold or the vintage. Now, the land of Israel, brothers and sisters, is to be a sheepfold for the slaughter of Gog. That'll be the first step. It's the battle of Armageddon. It sees the destruction of Gog in the land. But for the next 40 years, and particularly the last 30 of that 40, Europe will become a winepress for the destruction of antitypical Edom. Now, how do we know this? Well, we know it because Isaiah 34 is quoted in the Apocalypse. So come down with me and let's read verse 7. And the unicorn shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood. What land? Now you've got to understand that once the land of Edom has been identified in verse 5 and again in verse 6, that it's going to be the subject right to the end of the chapter. So when you read their land, he means the land of Edom. Now does he mean the literal land of Edom of ancient times? Clearly not. Because this is about all nations, okay? Particularly those nations who have sought the destruction of Israel. It's about all nations. So he's not talking about one pokey little land, okay? It's about all nations whose governments are going to be abolished. So their land, he says, shall be soaked with blood. For it is the day of Yahweh's vengeance, verse 8, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion. So this is about the struggle between two powers, the kingdom of men and the kingdom of God. One has its headquarters in Bozrah, so to speak, not literal Bozrah, but spiritual Bozrah, and the other one has its headquarters in Jerusalem. And there are two lands involved. There's the land of Edom and the land promised to Abraham. I'm going to see how this unfolds. Verse 9. And the streams thereof of what? Well, of the land of Edom. So the streams of the land of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and the dust of the land of Edom into brimstone, and the land thereof, that is of Edom, shall become burning pitch. It, the land of Edom, shall not be quenched night nor day, which is a way of saying permanent judgment. The smoke thereof shall go up forever. From generation to generation, it, the land of Edom, shall lie waste. None shall pass through it, the land of Edom, forever and ever. Now you might say, well, heck, that's a lot of repetition. Well, that's exactly the way God writes it. He wants you to focus on the land of Edom. And he doesn't mean the land that Esau possessed, or his people possessed. He means Babylon the Great. And this, if you want a land to associate with it, this is Europe. This is the base of Roman Catholicism in its opposition against Christ. It's called in Ezekiel 20 verse 35, the wilderness of the peoples. That language is picked up in Revelation 17, and a woman is seen sitting astride a scarlet-coloured beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Where's that? Well, it says it's not in a land, it's in an ocean. She's sitting on the seas, but it says it's a wilderness. Yes, it's a wilderness of peoples, because in verse 15 of Revelation 17 we are told that the waters where the woman sits, that wilderness, are peoples and nations and tongues. It's a wilderness of peoples. It's the wilderness of Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 35, into which Elijah brings Israel for judgment to be poured out through Israel upon Babylon the Great, that will be in rebellion against the rule of Christ. I'm going to talk quite a bit about this, so if you didn't catch some of that, don't worry. We've got to come back and we're going to circulate around that for the next couple of sessions. What I want to do in this session is to demonstrate to you that I'm not talking through my hat. And neither was Brother Thomas when he wrote Eureka. Not talking through his hat. Because this passage in Isaiah 34 verses 9 and 10 is actually quoted in Revelation chapter 14 verses 10 and 11. Now you can, if you want to, you can open both these sections and have a look at it. I invite you to do that. I'm just going to put it on the screen so we can see where the language of Revelation 14 verses 10 and 11 is drawn from. And the streams thereof, says Isaiah 34, shall be turned to pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone. And he shall be tormented. Now we're going to see who the he is in a moment. With fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. So it becomes burning pitch, this land of Edom. And it says this, it shall not be quenched night nor day, the smoke thereof shall go up forever. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. See, it's obvious where the language of Revelation 14 is coming from, isn't it? Now, those of you who have the same Bible as mine, the Oxford Bible, if you have a look at the margin alongside of verse 9 and 10, it says, go and have a look at Revelation chapter 14, verse 11. So even the translators knew that, didn't they? They knew that there was this quotation of Isaiah 34 in Revelation chapter 14, verses 10 and 11. Guess what Revelation 14 is about, brothers and sisters? Verse 8 says that another angel comes out after the 10-year proclamation of the saints, warning about the oncoming hour of judgment, the 30 years that will destroy the papal system, beginning with the destruction of the city of Rome, and then ultimately with the system itself. That hour of judgment is come. And then the second angel comes out and says that it's started. Babylon the Great is fallen! Is fallen! Verse 8. That's the destruction of the city of Rome, 10 years after Armageddon. And it starts the 30 years of the hour of judgment. And that is the culmination of it. The smoke of her torment goes up forever and forever. So this, brothers and sisters, is quite clear, isn't it? The Bible is interpreting itself. We don't need to impose anything upon it. We just need to see where it quotes itself. And you know what the subject's about. Now, if that's not sufficient proof, let's just read on to verse 11 of Isaiah chapter 34. And verse 11 says this, but the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it. It, yes, the land of Edom. The owl also and the raven shall dwell in it. So this it keeps on going through the context, you see. The cormorant and the bittern and the owl, these are unclean birds under the law of Moses, aren't they? You ever look at your margin? You got the same Bible I've got? You know what they tell you to do? Go and have a look at Revelation chapter 18. So why don't we do that? Revelation 18, verses 1 and 2. Revelation 18, verse 1 says this. And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. This is a reference to Christ and the saints. It's the mighty rainbowed angel of chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Now we're part of that, brothers and sisters. You can read that text and say, well, that's very interesting. If you read it the way God wants you to read it, you read about yourself. Because you, if you're going to be there in that day, will be involved in this work. This mighty angel is Christ and his glorified saints in the work of destroying the system of Babylon the Great. That's going to be our subject tomorrow morning for the exhortation. Who is this that cometh from Edom? But read verse 2. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and hath become the habitation of demons, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Who are they? Well, I'll tell you who they are. When you come back to Isaiah 34, they're identified. They are the unclean nations who will take possession of the territory of Babylon the Great, which is Europe, that will be vacated when every single Roman Catholic's destroyed. Because they support the Pope against Christ. That's intolerable. Here is the one that God sends to set up his kingdom. He defeats the Gogian Confederacy, which is in league with the Roman Catholic system, and Babylon's the head of the image. He sets up his throne, he demands their submission. They say, get out of here. You're the Antichrist. They spit in his face. And God says, right, you're Edom. You've sought the destruction of Israel. You have set yourself against my son. There's nothing I can do with you but to utterly destroy you. And so the people who inhabit Europe are doomed. They're doomed. And that's the message of Revelation 14. Another appeal is made after Rome itself's destroyed. Please, come out of her. Don't stand with this system anymore. And they still do, most of them. So there's only one end for them. Utter destruction. So that's what this is about. And because their territory, the land of Edom, Babylon the Great, European territory, is vacated, and there are no people living there anymore when the judgments are complete, Christ's not going to leave the land vacated, is he? No. He's going to give it to other peoples, and they will take it over because they've submitted to him. They will take over that territory and dwell in it. They're the unclean birds. They're the unclean birds of Isaiah 34 verse 11 onwards and Revelation chapter 18 verse 2. So let's read on. It goes on to talk about these birds and beasts. Look at verse 14. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl shall also rest there and find for herself a place of rest. There shall the great owl make her nest, and lay and hatch, and gather under her shadow. There shall the vultures also be gathered, every one with her mate. You know what happens here, brothers and sisters? It's incredible the way God presents this. You know what he's done in destroying Babylon the Great? Well, he's unwound the work of Nimrod, hasn't he? He's reversed the work of Nimrod. What do you reckon? Because we're going backwards here, reversing Nimrod. What do you reckon the next major event in history is? Well, the flood. And it was 100 years after the flood that Nimrod rebelled. So he goes right back to the language of the flood. None shall want her mate. And when Noah brought the animals into the ark, remember? 2 by 2. None wanted her mate. So he uses that language, and that's the way it unravels here in verse 16. Seek ye out the book of Yahweh and read. No one of these shall fail. None shall want her mate. For my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit has gathered them, and he hath cast the lot for them. Who's the them, do you think here? Well, the unclean birds. The unclean nations who are now converted, who take over the territory of the land of Edom, once possessed by Babylon the Great of the latter days. Okay? They're the them, brothers and sisters, of chapter 35, verse 1. There are no chapter divisions there, as you know. And in verse 1 we read this. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. Who's the them? The converted nations. When Christ has finally abolished every human government on earth, has established his kingdom fully, and gives an inheritance to those peoples who have submitted to him, after he's destroyed those who won't. That's the message of Isaiah 34 and 35. Now, what about these names? Bozrah, Babylon and Rome. You know, it's thought by some that Christ will have a conflict at literal Bozrah, which means in the land of Jordan, on his way to Jerusalem. Brother Mansfield, in his writings on this subject, explains very clearly that that's not the case. It is not the case. Christ will not have any conflict with anyone until he arrives on the Mount of Olives. And that great earthquake will be the beginning of 40 years of conflict. When I say he won't have any conflict with anyone, he's going to have some trouble in Egypt. He's going to smite and heal it. But in terms of conflict with his enemies, that's not going to begin until he arrives at the Mount of Olives. And you can pick this up from the language that is used here, because these names, Bozrah, Babylon and Rome, are in fact typical names. They're etymologically linked. Bozrah means sheepfold or fortress. Babylon was in the plain of Dura, which means a wall, a rampart or a dwelling. And Rome in Hebrew, Romith, has a numerical value of 666, which of course is perfectly, that's not by design. Or is it by design? A numerical value of 666, and it means fortification. Bosra was the capital of Edom, just as Babylon the Great, or Rome, is the capital of all nations who oppose Christ, as we've seen from those passages in Revelation 14 and 18. Now, Edom, in Jewish tradition, saw Rome as Esau. Brother Walker, in the Ministry of the Prophets, page 508, quotes Jewish writers to show how they saw in the oppression they suffered from Rome the rule of Esau. They referred to the Roman captivity as the Yoluf Edom, and saw in the miseries they suffered from AD 70 onwards an antitypical application of the oppressions their forefathers had suffered from ancient Edom. So when you look at this subject, it's clear what it's telling us. Now, we've had a look at the birds and the beasts of Isaiah 34. We know that birds and beasts are a symbol of nations. We've seen, as we've read down through verses 11 to 15, these unclean beasts, birds and beasts, represent the Gentile nations who have submitted to Christ. They've been released from Babylonian control when Rome is finally destroyed. We've seen in verse 17 that they possess the land of Idumea for the ad olim. You see there in verse 17, and he hath cast a lot for them, and his hand hath divided it unto them by line. They shall possess it forever. Now that's not forever and ever and ever. They are the two Hebrew words, ad olam. It's the duration of the millennium that's being referred to. And as we've said, they are the them of Isaiah 35 verse 1, for whom the once desolate wilderness of the land of Edom will flourish in the kingdom. Let's just take our minds back to what we read in Obadiah, without necessarily going back there. This is Rotherham's translation of Obadiah verses 15 to 17. And this will help us to see the consistency between these prophecies. For near is the day of Yahweh upon all the nations. Just as thou, Edom, hast done, shall it be done to thee. Thy dealing shall come back upon thine own head. For as ye, Edom, have drunk on my holy mountain, all the nations shall drink continually. Yea, they shall drink and swallow down, and shall be as though they had not been. But in Mount Zion shall be a delivered remnant, which shall be holy, and the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. That is in fact a summary of what we've just been considering in Isaiah 34. What I want to do now is to take you to Daniel and to show you the perfect harmony of these things in relation to Daniel chapter 7. So come to Daniel 7 and have a look with me at what it says about the destruction of the fourth beast. Now all of us, I think, are fully aware that when God puts together his great confederacy, he will have done so by incorporating all of the peoples that belong to the four world empires. And we know that Daniel chapter 2 is not just about four successive empires, is it? I mean, even the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists hold lectures about Daniel chapter 2. What they don't grasp is what is sometimes missed by us. That prophecy, Nebuchadnezzar's image, is not about four successive empires. Because Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, what God is revealing to the king is about the latter days. And then we read in verse 35 that the stone which is taken from the mountain without hands and busts the feet of this image so it collapses, the whole image is there because it says then was the iron and the clay and the brass and the silver and the gold broken to pieces together. Now if you broke it to pieces together, then the image is complete, isn't it? Which means that it is a confederacy of powers that have been drawn from the territories of all four world empires. They're all represented there in the latter days. That's Gog's confederacy of Ezekiel 38. Okay? So that's the drama of Daniel chapter 2. And of course Daniel 7 presents these parts of the image by different symbols. You've got the lion, you've got the bear and the leopard, and the fourth beast of Daniel 7 verse 7, the Roman Empire. And this is what it said about that fourth beast. Have a look at verses 11 and 12 of Daniel chapter 7. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, I beheld even till the beast, he means the fourth beast of verse 7, was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. So the fourth beast is Rome. What's its destiny? Total, utter destruction. What about the other parts of the image? We'll read on, verse 12. As concerning the rest of the beasts, this is the lion, the bear, and the leopard, and the territories they represent, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. In other words, they're not utterly destroyed. They are incorporated into the kingdom, and some of these peoples will be given the territory that's been vacated by Babylon the Great, otherwise known as the land of Edom. So let's summarise. Here in the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, the fourth beast represents the Gogian confederation with Babylon the Great at its head. The fourth beast is utterly destroyed by Christ, representing the complete destruction of Catholicism and its influence over the nations. But the rest of the beasts have their dominion taken away and their lives prolonged for 1,000 years, which is what a season and a time at the end of verse 12 represents. The fourth beast symbolises the power of the flesh in political and religious manifestation, that is, anti-typical Edom. That's why it has to be utterly destroyed. Now let's go back and see why that has to happen. It has to happen for this reason. This is the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ for 40 years after Armageddon. In Revelation 17 verses 1 to 3, John is invited to come hither. I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore, so here she is, that sitteth upon many waters, so it's waters. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, so it's a wilderness of waters. And we know from verse 15 that the waters represent peoples and nations and tongues. And I saw a woman, he says, sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. We don't have to argue about who that is, although people do. Because the last verse of Revelation 17 says, this woman, this system, is the city that rules over the earth. Now, who was ruling over the earth in the times when the apocalypse was given? Well, it's obvious. Rome. It's Rome. So the identification is clear. So here's the system. Let's have a look and see what happens when Armageddon occurs, and this system, having prepared its people, receives a heavy blow. Now Armageddon is called, in Matthew 24 verse 30, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Heaven? Yes, because this is about the establishment of a new government that's going to displace eventually every other human government. It's the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. You want proof of that, you can look up Revelation 1 verse 7. There's just no argument about it. Armageddon is going to see a massive blow to the power of Catholicism, because they're the head of the image. They're the thinking power behind the invasion of the land. They're the ones who authorise go to do what it's going to do. They're going to receive a heavy blow. And of course, the Pope won't suffer too badly. He'll survive, and so will Rome. And then they will rebuild their power. This is Psalm 2. Now, Psalm 2 is a fascinating psalm. I want you to come to Psalm 2. Psalm 2 talks about this period of time that you can see on the screen. Now, I wasn't intending to do too much on Psalm 2, so we'll be quick. Verse 1 of Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his Mashiach, his Messiah. Let us break their bands asunder, they say, and cast away their cords from us. He that sits in the heavens will laugh. Why is he laughing? Well, it's ridiculous what they're doing. Now, when is this happening, brothers and sisters? Well, it's post-Armageddon. It's in this period here. It's after the great earthquake which has decimated the cities of the world, destroyed man's infrastructure, brought the nations to their knees, destroyed yoke in the land, and they set themselves up against Christ. Well, because they prepared for people the doctrine of the Antichrist. Okay? Now, it's ridiculous. Now, how do we know this is post-Armageddon? Look at verse 6. Yet, says God, have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. This holy hill has been exalted by the earthquake. Right? It's now sticking up out of the earth. The land's been completely reshaped. And the first thing that Christ will do when Zion's exalted is establish the throne of David at its foot. At the foot of that mountain, he will establish the throne of David. And then he will send out the saints. And they will go out to do what Revelation 14 verses 6 and 7 says, to take out the mid-heaven proclamation. You know what's called a mid-heaven proclamation? Well, let's just say that the ceiling here is the heaven. That's government, okay? And let's just say that the floor is the earth. So the saints are going to go out mid-heaven. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, they're going to fly through the mid-heavens. It's talking about what they do with the governments and with the common people. Now, what do you reckon would happen if the saints went out to Europe, for example, after Armageddon, and say to the governments of the European nations, listen, Christ is in the earth, he demands your submission. You reckon that the governments of Europe will tell their people what the saints pass on to them? Not on your life. So that's why it's got to be a mid-heaven proclamation. And the message goes to government, and it goes to common people. So nobody's got an excuse. No one will be able to say, listen, you never told me. I never heard about this. They'll all know from rulers, common people. So that's why it's a mid-heaven proclamation. So when the 10 years of that proclamation is up, nobody's got an excuse. And that's why then Rome can be destroyed. The beginning of the 30-year period. Now, when Rome goes down the girdle, and there is a girdle underneath it, I can tell you, it's boiling up right now. When Rome goes down the girdle, 10 years after Armageddon, you read Revelation 14 carefully, and that's what it's telling you. Okay? That's going to be a massive blow to the papacy, because the Pope sitting in the Vatican, maybe restored from the damage of the earthquake, the Pope is sitting in the Vatican, he's going to go. Going to stop him, you think? No. They will resort to Central Europe, and they will rebuild the papacy in Mago. They will assemble the surviving cardinals. They will take a vote on who's going to be the next Pope, and there'll be white smoke. It's incredible, isn't it? And they'll go on for the next 30 years in opposition to Christ in this hour of judgment of Revelation chapter 14 verse 7. But by the time that they're rebuilding the papacy here in Europe, brothers and sisters, Elijah will have gathered the 14 million Jews that are scattered throughout the earth and will have brought them to Europe. It's going to be a big job, and many of you are going to be involved in it. He will have brought them to the shores of Europe, and they will assemble, and they will start their march through the wilderness of the peoples, the very home base of the papacy rebuilding itself in Europe. And God will use returning Israel as his vehicle of judgment against them. They have to fight their way back through those countries who oppose their return to the land, that they might submit to Messiah, which they themselves won't do. So in the end, Revelation 19 verse 20 will be accomplished. We'll talk about that tomorrow morning. And the papacy, the false prophet, and the system that supports him will be destroyed utterly. And there's a mopping up process that goes on. And finally Christ will establish his universal rule on the earth. That's the pattern. And this is all set out, by the way, in Eureka. You go and read that, it's all there in Eureka. And it's perfectly harmonious with what we find in the scriptures, both Old and New Testament. So this is all about the second exodus of Israel, the redemption of God's people from every part of the earth. And by the time the papacy is rebuilding itself after the destruction of Rome, Israel will be brought into the wilderness of the peoples. And there God says, I will contend, or or judge them face to face, and he's going to weed out the rebels. They will come from the land of the north. They will come from all parts, and they will come into this wilderness of the peoples, the place where the whore sitteth upon the scarlet-coloured beast. And so there will be 30 years of conflict in that place, in the hour of judgment. And the rebels will be purged out as they make their way back to the land, and they're baptised in the Euphrates and in the Red Sea, and brought into the bonds of the covenant, it says in Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 37. That's a word, as I said, many of us sitting in this hall, if we're privileged to be there, are going to be involved in. So here's the pattern. Look at it again. What's this all about? Well, this is about resistance to Christ's rule in the land of Edom. That's what God calls it in Isaiah 34, the land of Edom. It's going to be a horrible time for those people who resist his rule. But I want to tell you something about this, brothers. I want you to come back to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, just a minute or two. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave behind a DVD or a number of DVDs of the same thing and ask a brother to kindly copy for those who want a copy. Because I can't do in a couple of minutes what it took me an hour 15 to do on many occasions around North America. But we set out in that talk why we are so close to the return of Christ. And nobody who looks intelligently at the evidence will deny it. We are very, very close. You know some of the feedback I got on tour? When you present this sort of argument, it is so clear to most people. I had brethren come and say, oh, Christ won't come for 50 years. Come on. Where are you? What planet are you on? Don't you realise what God's doing in this year alone, 2011? Don't you realise that the world's economy is probably only 6 months away from going over the edge? And the world knows that. And we must be taken in times of prosperity. Christ makes that palpably clear. You'll be taken to judgment from times of prosperity, and they're about to disappear. And the papacy has to be destroyed by 2060. And that's only 49 years away. And we know there will be a 50-year period from the resurrection of the dead to the time when Christ walks his bride around a completed house about to go into service as a house of prayer for all nations. Come on. We're living on borrowed time, brothers and sisters. There's no question about that. And we are fools if we think we've got time. We don't have time. Christ is about to come. Now, I'm not saying, don't go and quote me and say that Jim Cowie said that Christ would come in 2011. But if you want to ask me when he's going to come, I'll tell you. I think he's going to come in 2011. And if he doesn't come in 2011, it won't be long after, because this world's economy is not going to last that long. And that's why all the evidence is there. And it is so obvious that it can't last very much longer. We're going to talk to the young people a bit about that tonight, because I want them to know the times in which they live. So what's the evidence? Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn. This little horn is the development of the Holy Roman Empire. It's the Western horn. Don't confuse this with the little horn of the goat, chapter 8. That's the Eastern horn. Okay? This horn here is the Holy Roman Empire. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of 758 and the 3 horns plucked up by the roots. We'll do that later on. What I want to talk about is when the Holy Roman Empire came into existence. And the Europeans know, historians know. You know, the French, when they developed their euro coin, they have the visage of Charlemagne on the back of that coin, and they have the dates 800 AD to 814, and he died in 814. But he had been king in Europe for decades. But he only became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. Christmas Day, very appropriately, 800 AD, by the way. And that's the date they've got there. 800 AD. They know that was the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. And it's got 1260 years and it must be destroyed. We're told that in verse 25. He shall speak great words against the Most High. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. Now, I don't need to go into lengthy explanations here. Most of us sitting in this hall have heard this before. A time is a Jewish time. In a Jewish year there are 360 days. God works on a day for a year principle. 360 days are time. What's times? Well, it's 2 by 360. And what's the dividing of a time? Well, it's half. So you've got 360 plus 720 plus 180. It equals 1260 years. Do you know, brothers and sisters, there has not been one single acquisition of power for the papacy in its history that hasn't terminated in exactly 1260 years. And I mean not one. And there have been many incremental acquisitions of power by the papacy, some huge, like your 529 to 533 Justinian decretals, like your 608, 610 Phocon decrees. You had your 1260, they came to an end exactly 1260 years later, and this one won't fail either. 800 AD was the last major acquisition of power by the papacy. The final one, and it has 1260 years to run. And when I sit with a piece of paper and I add 1260 to 800, I get 2060. And Sir Isaac Newton knew that date. Did you know that in his private papers, when he deals with Daniel chapter 7, he has a notation in the margin, papacy abolished 2060. He had to hide it. It wouldn't have gone down too well with the church, and he was writing in the late 1700s. Incredible, isn't it? He did what we should do. We should read the Bible, read prophecy, not on the basis of what we see. It's great when you see things happening that conform, but who cares? Whatever God says is going to come to pass. Whatever he says, regardless of the direction of events, that's what's going to come to pass. And that's how Brother Thomas interpreted Bible prophecy. And I'm sure he did the equation too. And he was writing in 1800, 1850. And he would have sat down and he believed Christ was about to come. And he would have worked out these dates. 2060? Impossible. Impossible. It's 200 years away. It's only 49 years away now. Only 49. So, brothers and sisters, we are on the cusp of the return of Christ. Because all he has to do between the destruction of the Pope and the empire, the Holy Roman Empire that supports him, all he has to do is to fulfill one verse. You know what that verse is? Revelation 19, verse 21. And the remnant of Roman Catholics who have supported assiduously the Pope for 40 years against the rule of Christ had to be mopped up. How long will that take, do you think? Probably about a year. If it takes 2 years, Christ will come in 2012. But it won't take 2 years. And the world's economy is not going to last for any more than a few months. Greece is about to go bankrupt. You heard that? Spain, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece are all effectively bankrupt. And the USA is not far behind them. USA has a budget deficit of $14.3 trillion. The interest payments on the debt not paying back. Just the interest payments on the debt are close to $500 billion a year. You know how much they take in tax in the American economy every year? $2 trillion. So a quarter of their tax intake goes on paying just the interest, not the principal. If you were doing that, they'd put you in jail. And they know, this is why the bottom's falling out of the US dollar. They know it's not going to last. And they're borrowing every single day $5 billion from the rest of the world. And they're scratching around because there's not too many nations want to lend it to them. $5 billion a day. And they've got a ceiling. You know what they use? The language they're using in the Congress about this? Repeating over and over again? Their language is, it's a financial Armageddon. A financial Armageddon. Yeah, it's about to go over the edge. So don't kid yourself. We're about to be taken to judgment. And we are about to be given a job if we're found worthy. And that job is to get rid of Esau out of the earth. To eradicate the spiritual descendants of Esau from the earth. So any typical evil relates to the political and ecclesiastical institution of Gentile nations who oppose Christ at Armageddon and beyond. Is analogous to the Gogian Confederacy of Ezekiel 38, when Brother Thomas says, Gog is the head of the house of Esau for a time. He's destroyed. And the headship returns to its rightful owner, the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church. This is about the end of the fourth beast, and its total destruction. Edom, brothers and sisters, does not apply to Arab nations except where they join themselves to go to seek the destruction of Israel. If they do that, yes, they're called Edom. But it's not about the Arab peoples. Now, I was going to talk a bit about these Arab peoples, but I think it's time for me to sit down. Let me just bring to you one passage. It's Isaiah chapter 21. Before I conclude, Isaiah 21. Verses 13 to 15. And I do this for a couple of reasons. Verses 13 to 15 of Isaiah 21 are about the future of the Arab peoples who live around Israel today. Verse 13. The burden upon Arabia, in the forest in Arabia shall ye dwell, O ye travelling companies of Dedan. Dedan was a descendant of Abraham. Okay? So there was a confusion of the line of Abraham and Cush in history, and Timur is now mentioned. Timur comes in verse 14. The inhabitants of the land of Timur. So we're actually talking about the peoples who live in this region. Without going into details, it's talking about the Arab peoples who live in this region. Okay? Bedouin peoples, travelling companies of Dedan. Not that too many, well, in fact, Bedouins are all over places like Jordan, and they can camp anywhere, even in your backyard. And you can't stop. There's a law. You cannot stop them camping in your backyard. So they're everywhere. This is the territory being referred to. And what's going to be their end? Well, it says this in verse 14. The inhabitants of the land of Timur brought water to him that was thirsty. They prevented him with their bread, him that fled. For they fled. Who's fled? Well, the Jews. They fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, and from the bent bow, and from the grievousness of war. So what's going to happen here is that when Gog invades the land and is victorious over Israel's army and the armies of all of the other powers that come, the all nations of Zechariah 14, is the Jews going to have to flee. Where are they going to flee? Well, to the south, to the east. Who's there? Arab peoples. Who's been there before them? Christ and the saints. To prepare those peoples to receive their brothers. They're going to be the opposite to Esau, aren't they? Opposite to Edom. They're not going to cut off the fleeing Jews like Edom did. And so what's their reward? Well, their reward is in verse 13. In the forest in Arabia. Anybody been to Arabia? Did you find a forest there? There are no forests in Arabia, but in the kingdom age there will be. And the desert will blossom as the rose. And this desert is no longer going to be a desert, it will be a forest. And who's going to inhabit the area around Israel? Well, these Arabs who support their fleeing brethren from the events of Armageddon. Arabia transformed in the forest, thickened with verdure, the word means, must ye lodge or dwell, and they will have the status of being next door neighbours to Israel. Now, what context are we in here, brothers and sisters? Read verse 1. The burden of the desert of the sea. When was the last time you saw a desert of the sea? Eh? You ever been in the desert of the sea? No. Well, there is no such thing literally, is there? But there is something scripturally that is a desert of the sea. You know what it's called? The wilderness of the peoples. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 35. So that's the context you're in. And how do I know I'm right? Have a look at verse 9. And behold, here cometh a chariot of men, and a couple of horsemen. And he answered and said, Babylon is full, is full. That's why I'm right. So when Babylon's destroyed, peoples like this who have submitted to Christ, who have succoured their brethren and not sought their destruction, will have a place in the kingdom. These are the ones of the other beasts whose lives are prolonged for a season and a time. But what about Edom? Edom is utterly destroyed. And tomorrow morning in our exhortation, brothers and sisters, we will have a look at ourselves in the vanguard of that power that God has appointed to destroy that system eternally. It's a wonderful prospect that each of us has. Who is this that comes from Edom? It's Isaiah chapter 63 verse 1, isn't it? Guess who that's talking about? Someone was sitting in front of it.